Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, August 24th, 1942. The jungle is breathing. Mist clings to the palms, and the air hums with insects and anticipation. Down by the Ilu River, what the Marines call the Tenaru, American soldiers crouch in silence behind sandbags and gun barrels, eyes fixed on the black water ahead. They've heard them for hours now. Boots in the shallows, soft whispers in Japanese. But still they wait. No one fires. No one moves. Across the river, hundreds of Imperial Japanese soldiers wade forward, bayonets glinting faintly in the moonlight. They believe the Americans are retreating. They believe the encirclement is complete. Then a flare hisses into the night sky. For one frozen heartbeat, the jungle turns white. And in that instant, the illusion breaks. Every machine gun, every mortar, every rifle along the riverbank opens fire as one. The Americans hadn't been surrounded. They'd been waiting. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. When the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in early August 1942, few of them had ever heard the name before. To most, it was just another jungle-covered island on a map, one of hundreds scattered across the South Pacific. But to the men in Washington and Tokyo, it was the first true test of the Pacific War. For months, Japan had advanced unchecked across the ocean, seizing territory from China to New Guinea. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the illusion of safety. By mid-1942, the Empire of Japan controlled a defensive ring larger than any in history, fortified by airfields and fleets across thousands of miles of ocean. Then the tide shifted. In June, at Midway, the U.S. Navy destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. The victory stunned Tokyo, but it wasn't enough. The Pacific was still vast, and Japan still held the initiative. That changed when American reconnaissance flights spotted construction activity on a small island in the southern Solomons. The Japanese were building an airfield. If completed, it would threaten Australia's vital supply lines. A dagger pointed south. The island's name, Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed its beaches. They landed in darkness, under thick jungle canopies and torrential rain, pushing inland with machetes and fear. At first, resistance was light. Japanese engineers fled into the forest, leaving behind half-finished earthworks and machinery. By the 3rd day, the Marines captured the airfield, a narrow strip of crushed coral that would soon be renamed Henderson Field. But the Marines were alone. The U.S. Navy, fearing Japanese air attacks, withdrew from the area, leaving the troops stranded with limited food, ammunition, and almost no air cover. What was supposed to be a swift occupation turned into a siege. From the sea, the Japanese Imperial Army watched in disbelief. Their base network had been violated. To Tokyo, Guadalcanal was not just a strategic loss, it was an insult. Orders went out immediately to retake the island and annihilate the invaders. The first counterattack force was the Ichiki detachment, commanded by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a veteran of China and a man whose pride equaled his aggression. He was promised reinforcements, but impatience got the better of him. Believing the Americans were few and retreating, Ichiki decided to attack at once. His men, roughly 900 strong, landed east of the marine perimeter under cover of night. They marched through swamps and palm groves, confident in their mission to crush the foreign intruders. What Ichiki didn't know was that the Marines were not retreating. They were entrenching, digging, wiring, and waiting along the Tenaru River's sand spit. Their guns zeroed in on every possible crossing point. The Americans would not move. They would let the Japanese come, because in this jungle war, patience would kill faster than courage. If stories like this move you, of courage, strategy, and survival against impossible odds. A quick click on the like and subscribe button tells us to make more of them. Night fell early on Guadalcanal. The jungle absorbed sound, and the heavy air seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere beyond the Ilu River, the Japanese were coming. Marine patrols had already seen their advance. Columns of men moving silently along the coast, bayonets fixed, rifles held high to keep them dry in the swamp water. But instead of confronting them in the open, American commanders chose something else. They ordered the men to hold their positions. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, roughly 800 men under Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, dug in along the east bank of the Tenaru. Machine guns were emplaced in pairs, interlocking their fire lanes. Mortars were zeroed on the narrow sandbar where the river met the sea, and the old 6-foot coconut log barricades, nicknamed the Sand Pit, became the spine of the defense. Pollock knew the Japanese doctrine well. They believed in shock, in swift, overwhelming assaults that broke enemy morale through aggression alone. To counter that, he planned an opposite tactic, to absorb their fury, then return it all at once. The Marines' position looked exposed. It was meant to. To the Japanese scouts, the sand spit appeared undefended. Just a few scattered outposts, and an open path across the river. It was bait. On the night of August 20th, Ichiki's men prepared for glory. They had been promised victory, told that a few hundred demoralized Americans stood between them and the airfield. Their bayonets were polished, their morale unshaken. As they assembled near the riverbank, they began to chant, the rhythmic cries of men invoking death before dishonor. Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! When the first wave stepped into the water, the current was cold, the moon half-veiled by clouds. They crossed in silence, moving through knee-deep shallows toward the dark shape of the sand spit. No gunfire, no movement, only the hum of the jungle. They believed the Americans had fled. In truth, every Marine on that line had their finger resting on a trigger, waiting for the order. At 2:30 a.m., Ichiki signaled the assault. Hundreds of men surged across the river. Behind them came light machine guns and mortars dragged through the mud. Still, no reply from the opposite bank. They thought the encirclement was working. They thought victory was seconds away. Then, a single flare rose from the Marines' line. It burst above the trees, flooding the river in ghostly white light. In that instant, every rifle and machine gun on the Tenaru opened fire. Tracer lines stitched across the water. Mortars exploded among the clustered troops. Men fell before they could even raise their rifles. What the Japanese thought was a retreat had been a perfect trap, one planned to the inch, one that would end with their annihilation. For the Americans, it was their first taste of total war in the Pacific. Many of the Marines along the Tenaru were barely 20 years old. Men who had grown up during the Great Depression, suddenly thrust into a jungle they could barely pronounce. They had been told to expect an attack, but not one like this. Through the flare's light, they saw something few soldiers ever forget. Waves of men advancing shoulder to shoulder, shouting for the Emperor, bayonets glinting like fireflies in the mist. The Japanese were not reckless. They were committed. Their officers led from the front, waving swords, believing absolute courage could overcome firepower. To the Marines, it looked like madness, but to the Japanese, it was honor. Colonel Ichiki had fought in China. He had seen poorly equipped enemies crumble before boldness. He believed the same principle would apply here, but he had misjudged both the ground and the enemy. Behind every sandbag, the Americans had prepared overlapping fields of fire. Each Browning machine gun covered the next. Each rifleman had rehearsed his arc of fire. It was a geometry of death. invisible until the first shot was fired. Private Charles "Red" Thompson, one of Pollock's men, later recalled the noise as like tearing the sky apart. For several minutes, the Tenaru turned into a glowing wall of tracers and explosions. The Japanese fell in the river, stumbled over their own dead, and still more came forward. What stunned the Marines was not their courage. It was their persistence. Even under withering fire, small groups crawled forward, dragging machine guns, trying to cross the sandbar again and again. Some reached the Marines' wire, hurling grenades before being cut down. Others tried to flank through the surf, where they met the same fate under Marine light tanks and .30 caliber fire. By dawn, the sand spit was a churned wasteland of smoke, sand, and silence. The Japanese had not broken through. They had been broken upon the line. But the night revealed something deeper. A clash of worlds. The Marines fought to live. The Japanese fought to die well. The American line held not just because of discipline, but because of restraint. Each squad leader knew the rule drilled into them by Pollock himself. Don't waste ammunition. Don't panic. Don't reveal your full firepower until you must. It was patience under pressure, the rarest thing in battle. And when they finally did unleash it, it was overwhelming. The illusion of being surrounded had drawn the Japanese forward into a pocket so narrow that every gun could strike at once. The Marines' decision to appear vulnerable was not luck. It was tactical art. To them, this wasn't revenge for Pearl Harbor. It was survival. And survival required precision. Across the river, Ichiki's survivors huddled behind fallen logs and broken trees. He could not comprehend what had gone wrong. His men had done everything they were taught: attack, overwhelm, close in. Yet the Americans had not run. They had waited. And now his proud detachment was being erased in the same way it had come. Wave by wave, Ichiki refused to retreat. To him, withdrawal meant disgrace. He ordered a renewed assault at dawn, one that would finish what the night attack had failed to do. But the Americans were ready for that too, and this time they would not wait for the enemy to come. When dawn broke over the Tenaru, the battlefield looked almost unreal. Palm fronds burned like paper. The sand was pocked with shell craters and the twisted shapes of equipment. And beyond the smoke, the Americans could still hear movement, survivors crawling in the mud, regrouping for one last charge. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock scanned the riverbank through binoculars. He had spent the night in the same trench as his men, watching the river flash with firelight. Now he prepared for the next move. Instead of waiting for another Japanese attack, he decided to finish it. He radioed for light tanks, the Marine Corps' M3 Stuarts, to move forward along the beach and flank the sand spit. Behind them came squads with flamethrowers and grenades. They advanced slowly, methodically, as machine gun fire covered their approach. This wasn't rage. It was calculation. Every movement was deliberate, aimed to prevent even a single counterattack from regrouping. The contrast between the two armies could not have been starker. The Americans relied on coordination. Officers communicating by radio, mortarmen adjusting fire from spotters, and tank crews advancing under signal flags. The Japanese, by contrast, were operating almost blind. Their radio sets were left behind to maintain speed. Their maps were outdated, and communication now relied on shouted orders through the chaos. Technology and training had shifted the balance of power. For all their bravery, Ichiki's men were fighting a modern, coordinated defense, one that punished every movement, every assumption, every tradition. Pollock's Marines embodied a new kind of warfare. Practical, unsentimental, and grounded in adaptability. They used cover, fields of fire, and ammunition discipline. Lessons born not from ancient codes, but from observation and efficiency. It wasn't glorious. It was effective. Yet, for many Marines, effectiveness came with a cost. When the tanks rolled over the sand spit, crushing what remained of the Japanese position, silence fell. Some Marines turned their faces away. The scale of destruction was unlike anything they had seen before. One corporal later wrote, "They kept coming, even when it was hopeless. I don't know whether to admire them or hate what made them do it." That conflict between respect and revulsion would mark the entire Pacific campaign. It wasn't just a clash of nations. It was a collision between two ideas of what it meant to die well. For the Japanese, death in battle was an offering. For the Americans, death was something to be avoided. Survived, outlasted. Each side saw the other as both brave and alien. After the fight, Marine medics moved among the wounded, both American and Japanese. Some of the survivors from Ichiki's unit, badly burned or bleeding, refused help. A few even reached for hidden grenades to take themselves and the medics with them. Others, dazed and silent, surrendered. The first Japanese soldiers many Americans had ever seen give up alive. It was a moment of revelation for both sides. The Americans realized that future battles would only grow worse. The Japanese realized that courage alone could not overcome firepower. But amidst all the noise, one truth stood out. The ambush at the Tenaru was not just a victory of weapons. It was a victory of understanding. Pollock and his men had learned to think like hunters, not prey, to make the enemy's certainty his weakness. It was this cold clarity, not hatred, that defined their success. Later that day, Colonel Ichiki gathered the last of his officers. Realizing the hopelessness, he ordered his regimental colors burned. Then he performed ritual seppuku beside the river that had swallowed his men. His final act, like his attack, was rooted in an older world, one that no longer existed. As word of the victory reached Henderson Field, the Marines did not cheer. They cleaned their rifles, refilled their canteens, and waited for the next night, because they knew more ships were coming. The war on Guadalcanal was far from over, but for now, at the Tenaru, the battlefield lay quiet. The ambush had ended, and with it, the illusion that Japan could ever take Guadalcanal by force alone. By the morning of August 21, 1942, the Tenaru River no longer flowed quietly. Its shallow current was red and slow, choked with debris, rifles, helmets, and the bodies of men who had believed they were invincible. Smoke hung above the palm trees, thin and white against the rising sun. At first light, the Marines advanced. Machine gun teams crept forward through the sand, rifles ready, eyes scanning for movement. The Japanese survivors, perhaps a few dozen, had dug shallow holes among their fallen comrades. They waited, rifles clutched, some muttering prayers, others preparing grenades for one final act of defiance. The Marines moved cautiously, bayonets fixed. They had learned quickly that in this war, a fallen body might not be finished, and silence did not mean safety. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock gave a simple order: clear the sandspit. Behind the infantry came the M3 Stuart light tanks, their small turrets glinting in the sun. Each tank carried a .30 caliber Browning coaxial gun and a .37 mm cannon, more than enough firepower to destroy the last pockets of resistance. As the tanks advanced along the riverbank, the Marines followed, fanning out in a slow, deliberate line. They moved past the first sand dune and into the open, the heat thick around them. Then, suddenly, fire erupted from the far tree line. A handful of Japanese gunners had survived the night. Their machine guns spat tracers into the sand, forcing the Marines to dive for cover. The tanks rotated, their barrels finding the flashes. A burst of cannon fire silenced the resistance in seconds. It was over almost as soon as it began. But Pollock wasn't satisfied. He knew many Japanese had retreated inland, hiding among the palm groves on the opposite side of the Tenaru. He ordered a flanking maneuver, half his men crossing the river at a shallower bend while the tanks provided covering fire. The crossing was eerie. The water was shallow, but the riverbed was slick, littered with bodies and broken gear. Each step reminded the Marines of what they had survived. On the far bank, they advanced slowly through the undergrowth. Grenades thudded into foxholes. Flamethrowers hissed, sending orange tongues of fire through the brush. Within minutes, the last organized resistance collapsed. Began as a Japanese offensive had turned into a complete encirclement. The very trap they had thought they were. Setting Colonel Ichiki's command post was found a few hundred yards inland. His maps were scattered, his radio smashed. Near the wreckage of his field table lay dozens of spent shell casings, evidence that he had fought to the end. He was dead, either by his own hand or by Marine fire. By mid-morning, the battlefield fell silent. The Marines began counting the bodies, over 700 Japanese dead, in a single stretch of riverbank less than half a mile long. They would later estimate nearly 900 total killed. It was a number almost beyond comprehension for a single night of combat. For the Americans, the victory was absolute, but the sight left many shaken. Some men had nightmares for weeks, not from fear, but from the image of so many lives spent in futility. They could not understand how an entire battalion had kept attacking when the outcome was already certain. Captain Charles Brush of the 2nd Battalion later wrote, "They were brave men, every one of them, but they were sent to die by a man who mistook pride for strategy." The Battle of Tenaru became the first major land victory for the United States in the Pacific War, a psychological turning point as much as a tactical one. It proved that the Imperial Japanese Army, though fanatical and skilled, could be defeated, not through numbers, but through patience, discipline, and coordinated firepower. The jungle had hidden the Americans. Their silence had deceived the enemy. Their restraint had won the night. But as Pollock surveyed the field that morning, there was no celebration, only exhaustion and silence. He knew that this was just the beginning. Japan would not retreat after one defeat. The next waves would come stronger, more desperate, more numerous. Still, Tenaru had sent a message, not to Tokyo, but to every Marine still alive on that island. They could hold. The battlefield still smoked when the order came to pull back and regroup. Behind them, the river carried away what remained of the Ichiki detachment. The Americans had endured the night. Now they faced what came next, the long, grinding struggle for Guadalcanal itself. By noon on August 21st, the jungle had gone still. The sound of gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the faint buzz of flies and the low hum of engines from Henderson Field. For the first time since landing on Guadalcanal, the Marines could hear their own thoughts. They had survived the first major Japanese counterattack, but the cost was measured in silence, not cheers. The Tenaru was no longer a river. It was a grave. The men of the 1st Marines began their grim work. They moved through the palm groves, rifles slung, collecting equipment, tending to the wounded, and counting the dead. The scene defied comprehension. Bodies lay tangled in wire and driftwood, some still gripping their rifles, faces frozen in determination. A few Japanese soldiers, terribly wounded, cried out for water. Marines passed canteens without a word. There was no hatred here, only fatigue, and something close to pity. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock ordered the field cleared, the positions reinforced, and the perimeter re-established. He knew the Japanese Navy might attempt to land more troops that very night. There was no illusion of safety on Guadalcanal, but as reports came in from along the line, the scale of the victory became clearer. Out of roughly 900 men under Ichiki's command, fewer than 24 had escaped to tell the story. The rest had been killed or captured. By any measure, it was a massacre, one that stunned even the victors. Far out at sea, aboard a Japanese transport, messages from Guadalcanal crackled through the static. The reports were fragmented, then silent. Tokyo waited for word of success that would never come. When Imperial headquarters finally received the truth that an entire detachment had been annihilated, shock turned to disbelief. Colonel Ichiki, once celebrated as a hero of China, was now dead, and with him one of Japan's finest regiments. The defeat at Tenaru struck deeper than numbers could show. For the first time, the Japanese army had met an enemy that did not break, an enemy that could think, adapt, and endure. The myth of easy victory in the Pacific began to fracture. At Henderson Field, the Marines dug in tighter than ever. Every man knew what the victory meant, and what it didn't. They had beaten one attack, but the island still teemed with danger. Disease, heat, and constant shelling would kill almost as many as combat. In the days that followed, engineers buried the dead in long, shallow trenches near the riverbank. A chaplain read brief words over the fallen, friend and foe alike. There was no time for ceremony. A few Marines stood apart, staring out over the water. One of them muttered quietly, "If this is the first, what'll the next look like?" No one answered. That question would echo across every island that followed, from Tarawa to Peleliu, Saipan to Iwo Jima. Tenaru was the beginning of a pattern. Brutal, relentless combat where no side expected mercy, and no battle ended cleanly. Yet even in the horror, there was clarity. The Marines had proven they could stand against Japan's most disciplined troops. They had shown that training, communication, and restraint could overcome sheer willpower. It was not technology alone that had saved them. It was calm under pressure. Guadalcanal had taught the Americans how to fight in the jungle, how to use patience as a weapon, how to turn the enemy's confidence into his undoing. And for Japan, the battle revealed something their commanders had refused to see, that bravery without strategy is suicide. Ichiki's death became a warning, whispered through the ranks of the Imperial Army. Never underestimate the Americans again. That night, as rain began to fall, the Marines lay in their foxholes, exhausted. Some wrote letters home, others simply stared into the dark, listening to the surf beyond the palms. A few feet away, the Tenaru flowed again, carrying its burden quietly toward the sea. In the distance, the faint glow of Henderson Field's lanterns shimmered through the mist. For now, they still held it. For now, the island was theirs. But they knew the war was only beginning, and that the jungle would take much more before it was done. When word of the victory reached the U.S. command at Espiritu Santo, the first reaction wasn't celebration. It was disbelief. An entire Japanese battalion, destroyed in a single engagement. For months, the Japanese army had seemed unstoppable. From Malaya to the Philippines, from Singapore to the jungles of Burma. But on Guadalcanal, the pattern broke. The Battle of Tenaru was more than a tactical success. It was the first time American ground forces had met the Imperial Army head-on and won. No carrier strikes, no naval bombardment, just infantry against infantry, jungle against jungle. In the reports sent back to Washington, commanders described the fight as complete annihilation. The Marines had lost fewer than 40 men. The Japanese, nearly 900. But those numbers told only part of the story. Behind them lay a deeper shift, in psychology, in doctrine, and in expectation. Before Tenaru, Many in the Allied command had assumed that Japanese troops were simply fanatical, unstoppable once committed. After Tenaru, they understood that courage without coordination could be exploited. Fire discipline, preparation, and combined arms, the slow, deliberate method, had triumphed over blind aggression. The news spread through the ranks like a steady current of relief. For the Marines dug in around Henderson Field, it meant one thing above all: proof. They could fight the best Japan had to offer and survive. The fear that had hung over the island since the first landings began to lift. Not entirely, but enough to breathe again. In Tokyo, the reaction was the opposite. Colonel Ichiki's detachment had been one of Japan's elite formations. The spearhead of a planned counteroffensive meant to retake Guadalcanal quickly. His destruction was an embarrassment too large to ignore. Imperial headquarters censored the news, claiming that Ichiki had died gloriously in battle. But privately, staff officers pored over his reports and realized the truth. He had underestimated the enemy and attacked without proper coordination or reconnaissance. The Army's initial fury gave way to grim resolve. New orders were drawn. Reinforcements would be sent, not hundreds, but thousands. The campaign for Guadalcanal was no longer a quick correction. It was a test of endurance, and Japan would throw everything it had to erase the shame of Tenaru. For the Marines, the battle left invisible scars. They buried their dead near the beach, marking each grave with a small wooden cross and a name scratched by hand. At night, the rain washed over the mounds, and the smell of fuel and gunpowder lingered in the air. Many of the young men who had fought at Tenaru had never seen combat before. They had entered the battle thinking of victory. They left it knowing what it cost. Private Robert Leckie later wrote, "We learned that night that war isn't about killing the enemy. It's about enduring longer than he can bear." That truth would echo through every island they touched afterward. The commanders, too, took lessons. General Alexander Vandegrift, watching the reports from Henderson Field, sent orders to strengthen defenses, dig deeper trenches, and prepare for the next assault. He knew the Japanese would return, in greater force, with heavier weapons, and with the same fearless determination. Tenaru had been a warning disguised as a victory. But beyond the smoke and strategy, there was something else. Something quieter. Among the Marines, a strange respect grew for the enemy they had just destroyed. They had seen men charge into machine gun fire without hesitation, fight to the last breath, die with their hands on their rifles. Even in defeat, the Japanese had shown a kind of purity of purpose that the Americans could not forget. It wasn't admiration, it was recognition of what war did to men when ideology demanded everything. That was the legacy of Tenaru. Not triumph, but understanding. The Americans had won the battle. But now they understood the war they were in. In the days following Tenaru, Guadalcanal itself seemed to shift. The jungle still steamed under the same equatorial sun, but the men who walked its trails were no longer untested. They had stared into the storm and come out alive. For the 1st Marine Division, the victory bought time. Time to reinforce, to dig, to build the perimeter that would soon be known as the Henderson Line. Around the captured airfield, engineers worked non-stop, shovels and bulldozers clattering through the mud. Every yard of coral cleared was a lifeline. Henderson Field meant resupply, air cover, survival. Within days, the first American aircraft, Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers, were landing on the strip that Japanese engineers had begun. From that moment, Guadalcanal ceased to be an isolated outpost. It became a fortress, yet the Marines knew what was coming. They could hear it each night, the low rumble of distant naval guns, the flashes offshore. The Japanese Navy, humiliated by the Tenaru defeat, began a campaign of nightly bombardments the men called the Tokyo Express. Each barrage rained steel across the island, shaking the ground, flattening tents, and cutting power to the airfield. By late August, intelligence confirmed that Japan was landing thousands of reinforcements on the western side of the island. The annihilation of Ichiki's detachment had not stopped the war. It had ignited it. In Tokyo, senior officers studied Tenaru with a mix of disbelief and pride. The soldiers had fought bravely, they said, but without proper coordination. The Imperial Army's analysts identified 3 failures: lack of reconnaissance, premature assault, and an underestimation of American defensive firepower. On paper, these were tactical lessons, but beneath them was a deeper revelation: that the Americans were not the undisciplined adversaries Japan's propaganda had promised. Colonel Ichiki's defeat became both a lesson and a wound. In Japanese doctrine, commanders were expected to win or die. Failure carried shame, not only personal but national. That shame would fuel the next offensives at Edson's Ridge and the Matanikau River, where Japan sought to reclaim its honor through sheer persistence. For the Americans, Tenaru became a teaching tool. Reports and photographs were sent to training camps in the States, illustrating what discipline, concealment, and patience could achieve. Officers lectured new recruits. Let them come to you. Make their courage your advantage. The battle also shaped Marine identity. It hardened their belief in small unit coordination and mutual trust. The idea that every foxhole was its own command post, every squad a miniature army. It was the beginning of the Marine way that would define the rest of the Pacific War. Strategically, Tenaru confirmed something Washington had only begun to suspect: that the Japanese army could bleed, and that America could sustain a prolonged fight. For months, the Allies had been on the defensive, reacting to each new Japanese advance. Now, at last, the initiative was shifting. The psychological effect was immense. A small victory on a nameless river became a symbol that the United States could stand on foreign soil and win, not through luck, but through planning. And for the Japanese, it marked the first shadow of doubt. From that doubt grew hesitation, and from hesitation, defeat. When the bodies were buried and the trenches refilled, the Tenaru returned to its quiet flow. Rain erased the footprints, vines crept back over the sand pit, and within months the battlefield looked again like jungle. But for those who fought there, it was never gone. They carried it with them, in the sound of gunfire that still echoed in sleep, in the faces of men who never rose from the mud. Guadalcanal would burn for another 6 months, but everything that came after, every ambush, every defense, every counterattack, began here, beside that narrow river, from a single decision: to wait, to let the enemy cross. To appear surrounded had come the first American ground victory of the Pacific War. It was proof that endurance, not fury, would decide the fate of empires. The Tenaru is a small river. It runs less than a mile before it meets the sea. A quiet, unremarkable stretch of water winding through palms and coral sand. Today, there are no trenches, no smoke, no sound but the wind in the grass. Yet beneath that stillness, history sleeps. For the Marines who survived, the battle never truly ended. It lived in their silence, in the way they stared too long at the horizon, in the letters that spoke of a long night by the river, but left out what it meant. They were not the same men who had landed 2 weeks before. They had seen what war demanded, and what it took in return. For Japan, Tenaru marked the first real fracture in the dream of unstoppable conquest. The empire that had expanded across the Pacific now faced an enemy it could not intimidate. one that fought not for glory, but for endurance. From that moment on, the war became not about speed, but survival. What happened at the Tenaru was never supposed to be remembered as triumph. It was a warning, written in the mud, that bravery without wisdom leads only to ruin, and that even the strongest armies can fall to those who wait. Every soldier on both sides believed he was doing his duty. Every man in that jungle fought for something he thought greater than himself. And in that shared conviction, even amid horror, there is a strange, solemn kinship. If you walk there today, you can still hear the river moving softly through the trees. It carries no sound of gunfire now, only the memory of what courage and tragedy can become when they meet in the same place. The Tenaru remembers, and so should we. The river remembers everything, and so do we. Subscribe to WWW Tales Stories to uncover more forgotten battles, quiet acts of courage, and lessons that history still whispers through time. What part of this story stayed with you most? Tell us in the comments. I'd love to read your thoughts.